The aliens should have killed him when they had the opportunity. Instead, they let him sit in that interrogation room, his wrists bound to the chair, grinning as if he knew something they didn't. It unsettled Captain Wrath. Humans weren't supposed to be a problem. Not after their fleets had been destroyed and their colonies burned. Wrath adjusted his coat, a ceremonial piece meant to project authority, and stepped toward the human. The room was sterile. Gray walls pulsing with the soft hum of containment fields, no windows, no exits except for the single reinforced door behind him. The human shouldn't have been smiling. "You understand your situation?" Wrath's voice was deep, heavy with years of command. He had interrogated prisoners before. Most broke within minutes. The human nodded, then rolled his shoulders as if getting comfortable. "Yeah, I get it." The arrogance was baffling. "You think we've won?" The human let out a sharp breath, maybe amusement, maybe something else. "Sure, you flattened our fleets, glassed a few colonies, made some speeches about superiority." He leaned forward slightly. "But I've got a question for you." Wrath watched him wearily. He had read the reports. Humans were erratic, but this one was particularly strange. He had been found alone aboard a drifting warship, the crew dead. Yet, he hadn't resisted capture, hadn't pleaded, hadn't shown any sign of fear. Wrath folded his arms. "Speak." The human's smile widened. "Why am I still alive?" Wrath frowned. "Because you surrendered." The human laughed. It wasn't nervous nor mocking. It was confident. No. I mean, why haven't you killed me yet? You've killed plenty of humans already. One more wouldn't matter." Wrath remained silent. He didn't like this. The human tilted his head. "You don't know, do you? You don't know why you haven't done it. It was a trap. Not a physical one, but something worse. A trick of words. A game of the mind." Wrath had been trained to resist psychological tactics, but something about this human's demeanor gnawed at him. He stepped closer. "We keep prisoners for intelligence purposes," Wrath said. "Yeah, but I bet you've had others before me." The human's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "And how did that go?" Wrath clenched his jaw. Truthfully, it hadn't gone well. Humans didn't break like other species. Even when subjected to pain, even when given the illusion of freedom only to have it ripped away, they held on. Some laughed in their cells, some whispered to themselves, and some just waited. But the cat Hari still hadn't figured them out. The human exhaled through his nose, stretching his fingers against the restraints. "You're afraid of us." Wrath almost laughed at the absurdity, but the words settled in his mind before he could dismiss them. "We crushed your empire," he said firmly. "You think that was our empire?" The human shook his head. "That was an experiment." The simplicity of the statement unsettled Wrath. The war had lasted 6 years. Billions had died, and this human had the audacity to call it an experiment. The human leaned back in his chair, seemingly unbothered by his confinement. "You don't understand humans, Captain. You think you do because you've seen our cities, our fleets, our soldiers." His fingers tapped against the armrest. "But that's not who we are." Wrath scoffed. "Then what are you?" The human met his gaze, his grin fading just slightly. "Survivors." Wrath had heard similar boasts from other species before. It meant little, but there was something in the way this human said it, something in his eyes, that made it feel different. "Survivors?" Wrath repeated. "Your world burns. Your fleets are dust. And you call yourselves survivors." "Yep." The human's fingers drummed against the chair again. "You wiped out a few billion of us, and I'm telling you, that's not nearly enough." Wrath stiffened. There was no desperation in the human's tone, no attempt to plead or manipulate. He was stating a fact. The human let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "Your people planned this war for decades, didn't they? Studied us, figured out the weak spots, struck fast, struck hard." He nodded to himself. "Smart move." Wrath didn't respond. The human chuckled. "Thing is, we never had a plan for you." He leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "We make plans after we lose. Raph felt an unexpected chill crawl up his spine. The human seemed to sense it. You ever back something into a corner, Captain? Something that doesn't know how to quit. His eyes darkened. That's when things get interesting. Raph forced himself to remain composed. You think we fear a species on the brink of extinction. I think you should, the human replied easily, because you made one mistake. Raph tensed. You let me live. Before Raph could respond, the door behind him slid open with a hiss, breaking the moment. One of his officers stepped in, mandibles clicking in agitation. Captain, a matter requires your attention. Raph exhaled sharply, casting one last glance at the human before turning away. Stay here. We are not finished. The human smiled again, as if he had already won something Raph couldn't see. Then, as the door shut behind him, the human flexed his fingers against the restraints and began working on them. The officer hesitated, and that was concerning. The Kathari ran a strict hierarchy. Officers did not hesitate. We don't know how, the officer admitted. The field is stable, but its readings fluctuate slightly, as if something inside the chamber is. He paused, searching for the right words. Resonating with it, Raph stopped. Resonating? We're investigating, the officer said quickly. It's possible the human's biosignature is interfering with the field in ways we hadn't accounted for. That shouldn't have been possible. The Kathari had studied human physiology thoroughly. Their biology was unremarkable compared to other species. No natural energy emissions, no inherent psychic abilities. And yet something about this particular human felt wrong. Has he spoken? Raph asked. The officer hesitated again. Not directly, but he's humming. Raph stared at him. The officer continued, his discomfort growing. A rhythmic sound repeating low frequency. The monitoring crew described it as, he clicked his mandibles, clearly struggling for a word. A song? Raph turned sharply and resumed walking. A human song should have been meaningless, but everything about this prisoner suggested meaning in places where none should exist. He reached the brig moments later and stepped into the observation chamber. Several technicians monitored the containment field, and the screen showed the human still bound to his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest in time with a strange, steady hum. The containment field pulsed. It wasn't failing, but its energy wavered as if adjusting itself in response to the human's presence. Raph watched the screen carefully. The human stopped humming and looked up. Raph knew the human couldn't see through the observation glass, but in that moment, it felt as if he could. Open the comms, Raph ordered a technician. The human's voice came through casually, calmly. Back so soon? Raph stepped closer. What are you doing? The human tilted his head slightly. You'll have to be more specific. Raph gestured toward the pulsing field. The interference. The human glanced at his restraints, then back up at the unseen observation window. Oh, that. I'm just thinking. Raph didn't know how, but it was clear the human was attempting something. You are attempting something, Raph said. The human smiled again. I told you before, Captain. You don't know what we are. Raph studied him. There were no detectable changes in his vital signs, no unusual energy readings, and yet the containment field was reacting. I could end this now, Raph said. Your kind has no leverage. The human exhaled through his nose, the way humans did when amused. That's your second mistake. Raph's mandibles tightened. And what was the first? The human's fingers tapped the armrest again. Not knowing how the story ends, a technician stiffened at the console. Captain, the containment readings are fluctuating again. Raph turned sharply. The screen showed it clearly. The energy field pulsed in sync with the hum, the drumming fingers. The rhythm matched perfectly. Raph whirled back to the prisoner. What are you doing? The human grinned. Nothing. The moment stretched, but the field didn't fail. Its pattern continued shifting, adjusting. Then, without warning, the entire ship lurched. Alarms blared as the vessel's artificial gravity flickered. Wrath grabbed the console to steady himself. "Status," he barked. A panicked voice came over the internal comms. "Captain, we're detecting a breach." "No!" "Multiple breaches. Systems are failing across multiple decks." Wrath's eyes snapped to the screen. The human was still there, bound, unmoving, watching. "How?" Wrath demanded. The human's expression didn't change. "I told you. You should have killed me when you had the chance." The ship trembled again, and Wrath felt something he hadn't in decades: unease. This wasn't an external attack. It was coming from within. Wrath forced his breathing to stay steady as the ship shuddered once more. The alarms howled through the bridge, overlapping with frantic reports from all decks. Containment breaches across the vessel, energy fluctuations in critical systems. "Captain, we're losing control." The officer's voice cut out as static overtook the transmission. The ship lurched again, throwing Wrath forward. He slammed into the console, catching himself before his head could meet the cold metal. He turned toward the observation screen. The human was still there, still bound, still watching. The containment field around him pulsed, no longer in sporadic fluctuations, but in precise, methodical intervals, like a pattern, a rhythm. Wrath's mandibles twitched as realization struck. "You're using the ship's systems against us." The human flexed his fingers slightly. "I'm not doing anything." He gave a slow nod toward the walls. "The ship is listening." Wrath snarled. "Impossible." The human exhaled again, that quiet sound of amusement. "You still don't get it, do you?" The vessel groaned. Lights flickered, casting the brig into alternating patches of darkness and sickly blue. The energy field around the human rippled like the surface of disturbed water. Wrath turned to his technicians. "Shut down the containment field." "Captain, if we do that..." "Do it." One of the crew obeyed, fingers flying across the control panel. The energy barrier collapsed in an instant. The human didn't move, but the ship did. A deep, thrumming sound reverberated through the corridors, vibrating in Wrath's very bones. It wasn't just power surges or failing systems. It was something else, something alive. The human shifted in his seat. "Y'all studied us, but you never really listened." His voice was softer now, almost expectant. "Humans adapt. Humans improvise." His fingers tapped again, sending audible clicks through the metal of the chair. "And humans," he said, "we build things that learn." The walls trembled. The power conduit lining the brig sparked. Wrath took an involuntary step back. "You're lying," he said. The human's eyes never left his. "No, Captain. You're just too slow to keep up." With a final deliberate motion, he pressed his fingers into the chair's armrest. A long, deep note rang through the ship, low, resonant, undeniable. The ship responded. The containment chair unlocked. The restraints hissed apart. The human stood. Wrath's hand reached for his sidearm. "Security, neutralize him." The technician scrambled to react, but the doors to the brig slammed shut before they could even call for help. Control panels flickered. Consoles went dark. Emergency lighting bathed everything in a crimson glow. The ship had made its choice. The human rolled his shoulders, flexing his wrists as if shaking off centuries of weight. He turned his head slightly, listening to the deep hum of the vessel around him. "Funny thing about warships," he mused. "They're built for efficiency, for automation, for survival." He took a step forward, then another. "But more importantly, they're built to take commands." Wrath raised his weapon, claws tightening around the trigger. "You will stand down." The human shook his head. "Not today." The ship groaned once more, and then everything changed. The artificial gravity shifted, sending Kadhari officers sprawling. Control stations flared with error messages as every security override failed simultaneously. Wrath's weapon was torn from his grip and flung into the wall as magnetic forces twisted out of alignment. The human stood firm. He took his time stepping toward the door, as if savoring the moment. You thought wiping out a few billion of us meant the war was over. He reached out and placed his hand against the metal. The door, once reinforced and impenetrable, hissed open as if it had been waiting for him. He stepped into the corridor. Kathari's soldiers were waiting, rifles raised. But before they could fire, the ship intervened. Bulkhead slammed shut, separating them. The lighting flickered again, and in that brief moment, Wrath saw something he never thought possible. The human was smiling, not in amusement, not in mockery, but in certainty. This was never an escape attempt. It was a takeover. The ship had been his the moment they captured him. Wrath lunged for the comms. All units, abandon ship. Abandon. The speakers cut out. The human's voice replaced them. Too late. The bridge screens went black. The alarm stopped. The only sound left was the quiet hum of a vessel that had chosen a new master. Wrath slumped against the console, mandibles parted in shock. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose. The human had warned him. Humans don't surrender. They adapt.